These days, the world comes at you fast and furious. The daily news cycle, social media, people yelling on TV. If that's what you want, then this is not going to be your show. We're going to do global affairs a little differently. So, why don't you grab a coffee, sit tight, and brew with me on something that you probably haven't thought that much about. I'm Damien, and this is another episode of Coffee and World. Sometimes the news gives you just the hook that you're looking for. Here I'm talking about this recent brouhaha with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Now, The Rock isn't alone. Celebrities like Nicolas Cage have long been into collecting dinosaur fossils. I mean, are you really surprised from the guy who made National Treasure? The growing private market for dinosaur fossils didn't just happen by happenstance. It has been a global fossil-fueled boom. Little known to many outside of paleontology, these days a new dinosaur fossil is discovered every few weeks, not years. This golden era of discoveries has led to vast private and public interest. And you guessed it, the US and China are playing starring roles. As two major centers of paleontology, US-China scientific collaboration in this field has persisted despite tensions. Not only have Chinese fossil finds reinforced the scientific consensus of what dinosaurs became, it has also led to a market that wants to profit from this boom.
There's overwhelming evidence that links birds and dinosaurs. But what's really cool is the piece de la resistance. In China, in 1996, a feathered dinosaur, the first feathered dinosaur, was found.
Now, before venturing farther afield to China's Liaoning and Inner Mongolian plateaus, we're going to start right here in Chicago. All these years in Chicago, I had no idea that it is something of a paleontology hub. But, there were clues. Take O'Hare Airport, the gateway to Chicago. As you stroll down Concourse B in the United Terminal, you'll be greeted by this towering Brachiosaurus fossil. It has always seemed bizarrely out of place for an airport, but not anymore, now that I know Chicago's centrality in U.S. paleontology. The Field Museum here houses the most complete T-Rex fossil ever found. It's also where Jing-Mai O'Connor now works as a fossil curator after returning from China. NPR even did a story on Sue's discovery in South Dakota and the $8.4 million winning bid that brought it to the museum. Moving down south to Hyde Park, one of the country's leading fossil labs sits inside a University of Chicago building that also works on atomic particles. And that's where I met renowned paleontologist Paul Sereno. Paul has trained a generation of paleontologists, and his lab was a crossover of a museum and a shop class, except strewn with giant rocks and precision tools. The whole time I was talking to him, I was staring at this. These dinosaur chickens, as Paul calls them, were the only herd discoveries in China's Inner Mongolia, and they died because they got stuck in the mud. Paul had been in and out of Inner Mongolia since the 1980s, first as a photojournalist traveling around China. And since then, he sent fossils to Chinese museums. And on one of his expeditions, found a dinosaur in the Tibetan plateau with a pretty crazy backstory.
The Lhasa terrain is where we found the dinosaur. It used to be a tropical island making its way across an ocean. It was died, fossilized, got accreted onto Asia, and then lifted to the sky 13,000 feet. What a story.
Lately, he has been working on sites in Niger, Africa, which could be the next frontier of fossil finds. But back here in Chicago, Paul's the brain behind an ambitious project to spread paleontology even wider in the city of Big Shoulders. He's planning for a STEAM and paleontology hub for Southside Chicago communities. Paleontology has always captured the public's interest and imagination. Rarely is there an adult profession that is the realization of childhood fascination. But the fieldwork of a paleontologist is no child's play. You have to get thousands of pounds of rock in which bones are preserved out of the ground, and then transport all of that in good condition. It's risky and it's tough work, but that's also what makes the unearthing of natural history a global enterprise by nature. It requires digging where the biological resources are, not just in your home country. In this sense, it's kind of like oil. No coincidence, it's also called a fossil fuel. And over the last decade or so, China has become something of a Saudi Arabia of fossils. Fossils have been discovered since the time of the Greeks, but the formalization of paleontology as a discipline came in the 1800s. For more than a century, It was a discipline mainly dominated by Western countries. Europeans and Americans had the expertise and also the money to fund programs and digs. The dinosaur rush in America coincided with its Gilded Age, captured in the so-called Bone Wars between Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. Both men competed ferociously until their financial ruin, but they did obtain a trove of fossils for scientific study along the way. But dinosaurs didn't just park themselves in the Western world, and when continents drifted apart after the Cretaceous period, well, fossils were dispersed everywhere. So, developing countries became new paleontological frontiers as the profession globalized. In the early days, developing countries didn't really understand the value of fossils or what to do with them. That's because many discoveries were purely accidental and found on farmland. Farmers didn't really know how to assign value to the old bones they found. And even if they could, all the museums that would house and study those fossils were in advanced economies. But as developing countries started to catch up with Western economies, they too invested heavily in science, as well as the ecosystem around science, like museums. And those countries' views on the bones in the ground changed accordingly. So why send fossils to places like America and Europe to be studied? Better to keep them in developed domestic capacity. And nowhere has this trend been better exemplified than in China. It has built one of the largest paleontological institutes in the world under the Chinese Academy of Sciences. It's called the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, or IVPP. And that's where Jingmai O'Connor worked for a decade before coming to Chicago. She exemplifies US-China scientific collaboration, but the dynamics have been changing.
China has everything it needs to become probably the best, most important place in the world to do paleontology. In order to be a world-class paleo institution, international collaboration is part of that.
China's rising capabilities in paleontology means it has more resources and more expertise at its disposal. A natural outgrowth of that is that China now relies less on foreign expertise. In fact, collaboration is running more in the other direction, where foreign paleontologists are trying to gain access to China's fossil discoveries. That's because in 1996, a Chinese discovery shook the paleontology world. It transformed how we think about dinosaurs. It was the year the first intact feathered dinosaur was found in Liaoning province. It was named, get this, Sinosauropteryx. It's a mouthful. And who was it that discovered this feathered creature? You guessed it, a Chinese farmer stumbled upon what he thought was a dragon bird. That chance discovery put Chinese paleontology on the map and catalyzed a fossil boom that continues to reverberate across the world. At the IVPP, avian dinosaur expert Xu Xing has named so many new species that there's now even a Wikipedia page about them. Of course, the Sinosauropteryx wasn't the only feathered dinosaur. It turns out that the almighty T-Rex had an extended family that had feathers too. Standing at around 10 feet, the Guanlong, or crown dragon, was named by Xu in 2006. That 1996 discovery certainly went a long way toward turning on the money spigot for entities like IVPP. But Chinese paleontology's takeoff in the 2000s wasn't just about state funding. It turned out China was sitting on a gold mine of fossils.
You have this terrain that had lake beds and volcanoes and sediment coming in all at the same time. It was sinking. With a complex of China sort of amalgamating these little microplates, you had this very complex little ranges. If you look at the thing of the provinces you know well, I mean, oh my God, there's little mountains here and there up in Liaoning, then you got the Inner Mongolia, then you got the Kunlun Mountains, and then you go out west, you got a basin, and Xinjiang Basin. You've got dinosaurs from all the way from Xinjiang all the way to Liaoning and up into Harbin.
So China was naturally endowed with geological conditions that preserve fossils well in relatively accessible rock formations and deserts. The richest fossil finds are concentrated in the borderlands between Liaoning and Inner Mongolia, and more specifically, around the city of Beipiao, Liaoning. Several natural formations collectively called the Jeho biota have been the sites of great finds. That whole stretch of rocky terrain extends into Inner Mongolia, where the Yannao biota also contains a wealth of fossils. The Jeho takes the cake when it comes to the diversity and abundance of mint-condition fossils. Fossils have been found on almost every continent, yet one of the largest concentrations of it just happens to sit in the middle of China's Rust Belt. Yep, Bapel is an industrial coal mining town situated in a region that has struggled for decades to reinvent itself. No wonder fossils keep on popping up there, because digging into the ground has been the trade of the area. Intrepid locals quickly realized that there was a market for this stuff. And just maybe, it's a chance to reinvent the dead-end coal town as a tourist destination full of fancy dinosaur museums. Fossils need places to hold and display them. Local governments saw museums as just another investment that could generate income and boost GDP, so the Bapel Pterosaur Museum sprung out of nowhere. It even has a Facebook page, and there are also larger, more official museums like the Liaoning Paleontology Museum. But cashing in on fossils also leads to problems like forgery, because new species command more money and attention, and Joe the farmer wants credit for new species.
The farmers will sell the fossils, and a lot of farmers have become professional collectors, and they've realized that that's far more lucrative. And since the first boom in the late 90s, where they start realizing that you can collect these things and sell them, now, like 30 years later, right, or 25 years later, these are professional collectors, and they know their stuff, because they're so smart, and they have to be, because they know when they have a new species, right?
Sure, technically, you're supposed to register new fossil finds with an entity like IVPP, but it's tough to regulate something like this. The Chinese government may own all the land, but it can't possibly always track what's found underneath that land. And in fact, it has an abiding interest in relying on local discoveries to cover vast territories. Some of the most dramatic finds in the J-Hope biota have been accidental encounters. On the other hand, you want the best new fossils to be treated like public goods that are handed over in the interest of scientific inquiry. This tension between the commercial market and the scientific market isn't exclusive to China, nor is it particularly new. For as long as there have been fossils, there have been buyers and collectors. So, Nicolas Cage bidding on a dino skull isn't that out of place. Remember, even the Field Museum had to go up against private bidders to secure T-Rex to sue. It's probably not so dissimilar from the art market. Does that rare original Picasso belong on a private collector's wall, or in the MoMA? But there's also catch-22. The hotter the fossil market, the more incentive there is for Chinese farmers to dig for fossils. And again, like the art dealer world, fossil auctions are usually opaque transactions, paving the way for counterfeits and smuggling. Just look at T-Rex Stan, whose skull sold for $32 million to an anonymous buyer. And that's how The Rock created a stir by displaying his skull on live TV. Was that just a replica, or did the real Stan stand up? No one really knows for sure. So the commercial market has taken that T-Rex skull out of the supply that could have gone to a lab or museum to be studied. That seems to be the main bone of contention against the commercial market, because fossils aren't just pieces of inanimate art. They used to be living and breathing creatures that reveal our planetary history. But should all fossil finds belong in the public goods category, even if it was found on private land? After all, evolutionary history isn't public or private, and wanting to own a piece of that history isn't necessarily wrong in a meaningful moral sense. And public funding for paleontology museums will always be limited, since doing paleontology isn't cheap. Long expeditions and tons of equipment. Private capital may be a necessary source of funding. At best, perhaps a kind of code of conduct between paleontologists and private collectors can be used to assess what fossils meet the public interest threshold. Now, I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but drawing that clear line between paleontology and profit isn't easy. Jurassic Park tried to tackle that quandary, and look what happened. A well-intentioned uber-capitalist funds the cloning of dinosaurs so that paleontologists will have the best lab to study extinct creatures. Then a bunch of things go wrong. Jeff Goldblum gets chased by a T-Rex, Newman from Seinfeld loses a shaving cream can. Yeah, okay, you've seen the movie.
Well, maybe dinosaurs have more in common with present-day birds than they do with reptiles.
Look at the pubic bone, turned backward, just like a bird. Look at the vertebrae, full of air sacs and hollows, just like a bird.
And even the word raptor means bird of prey.
Well, Dr. Alan Grant was right. Dinosaurs are among us today. They're just a lot smaller, have feathers, and fly around. But was the movie's premise a glimpse of the future? Well, if George Church has his way, that future isn't too far off. Church runs a lab at Harvard that is working to bring back the woolly mammoth using CRISPR technology. Yes, that mammoth and that CRISPR from the last episode. He has the backing of a new startup appropriately named Colossal and $15 million to attempt such a feat. The mammoth would initially be a hybrid Asian elephant, gene-edited to be much hairier and tolerate Siberian temperatures. The capabilities of synthetic biology, as Church calls it, has advanced significantly, but genetic engineering of this sort still requires a key ingredient: ancient DNA. For extinct animals, the DNA typically has to come from fossils and not from mosquitoes trapped in tree amber. At the very least, Church would have no shortage of fossils to experiment on, and if people like him somehow succeeds, even if only a mammoth, then the debate over profit in paleontology may seem somewhat quaint. Alright, now let's get over to Milan, where Sophia's going to zoom in on global supply chains. Till next time.
Ciao, and welcome back to Coffee and World. Do you remember my breakdown of the trash trade in the last episode? Well, that trade, like all global trade these days, depends on two key things: container ships and open shipping routes. And both of these are inventions of the second half of the 20th century. So, let's get right into the important roles they play in global trade and today's geopolitics. I don't need to tell you how important global trade is. Supply shortages, traffic jams at ports, and inflation have been all over the headlines. And the single image of global trade that dot these pages, it's this. Longer than 4 football fields or the Empire State Building, cargo ships like these can hold as many as 20,000 containers. And because a single container could be filled with more than 200 bikes, it means that a vessel like the Ever Given is technically able to transport enough bikes for every citizen of Milan and Rome combined. We take this container for granted today, but it actually had to be invented by this American in 1956. As a former truck driver, McLean got sick of waiting for ages at ports for ships to be unloaded manually, and he came up with the idea of a steel box that could fit all sorts of goods and easily transport them. Indeed, before the invention of containers, shipping was an extremely lengthy and expensive process. It's sufficient to think that goods used to spend more time at docks than at sea, and that dock workers used to account for 70% of the final shipping costs. But thanks to, well, precisely a huge container and the standardization of its size, loading goods on trucks or trains became automated, and that exponentially cut time and transport costs. And now we know that that simple invention ultimately had an outsized impact. As the shipping industry became so convenient, pretty much anything from fresh bananas to cars or, well, trash could easily make it to the other side of the planet. And that's how we got to these super extended and interconnected global supply chains, which have functioned so well that most people hardly ever thought about what's behind them, making of global shipping something of an invisible industry. But then this happened in the middle of a pandemic, and all of a sudden the industry came under a huge spotlight. That was somehow the perfect pandemic meme, right? We were all rooting for the Ever Given and ourselves to get unstuck. But this was a different kind of Suez crisis, and we'll get to the first one that crystallized the importance of waterways and shipping routes that stitched together the international economy. While the Suez Canal is no stranger to blockades, one that lasted up to 8 years, nowhere near 12% of our record volumes of global trade passed through it back then. Therefore, this time, even a few days of traffic jam in the canal were enough to wreak havoc in the international trading system, especially at a time when we were all buying things online like crazy because, well, what else could we do? But how did the Ever Given get stuck in the first place? Well, one practical reason is that in the last 25 years, vessels have quadrupled in size, and existing canals simply weren't built to accommodate them. That's why in recent years, both the Panama and Suez have been expanded, but apparently, still not quite enough. Yet no matter their size, straits and canals have always been at risk of turning into potential bottlenecks, either accidentally or intentionally. Precisely for the central role that waterways play in the global economy, many countries have long wanted to control them for their own benefit. And while the notion of freedom of navigation may be taken for granted now, it was actually borne out much geopolitical contestation. Yep, battle for control of sea lanes are as old as the Trojan War, a war that was more likely initiated to win mastery of a strait, rather than to win Helena's heart. In fact, it was probably Greece's ambition to take control of the Hellespont, today known as the Dardanelles, that pushed it to war against Troy. And this because the Hellespont represented the key access to trading routes in the Black Sea and its bordering countries. And by the same token, Russia's foreign policy centuries later was mainly about controlling the Bosphorus and Dardanelles to expand its military and commercial routes through the Mediterranean. Now, let's fast forward to the rise of Pax Britannica. The main reason that the sun never set on the British Empire, of course, had much to do with its dominance of the seas, and of straits too. The British Empire, in fact, was seen together with purpose. It's no coincidence the British colonies were formed around the most important shipping routes in the world. Take Singapore, a former British territory that sits in the middle of the crucial Malacca Strait. Soon after the city-state was founded, it was immediately turned into a free port to serve as a major trading hub between the East and the West. And arguably, much of its incredible economic growth has been the result of that decision. Now, let's return to where we began with the Suez. Just like empire's power may depend on control of key waterways, their unraveling can also be precipitated by the loss of that grip. And that's exactly what happened to Britain when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956. Ironically, in the same year that the container was invented.
While in Egypt, the steadily growing power of the regime which overthrew Farouk has been evident to the world. The Western nations, thinking of the Suez Canal, watched uneasily. Egypt turned eastwards for her supplies of arms, and Russia's Foreign Minister Shapilov found Nasser a ready customer.
This episode, which almost triggered a nuclear confrontation, eventually marked the nothing short of the task of European imperialism. And as it turned out, the sun eventually set on the British Empire. Empires may be relics of the past, but straits or canals are today as relevant as they've ever been. And depending on where you sit, these waterways can either be a leverage or a choke point. For a country like China, it's the latter. China depends on imports for 3/4 of its energy consumption. And because 80% of that trade passes through the Malacca Strait, China is highly vulnerable to its potential blockade. This is certainly one of the reasons why China has significantly expanded its naval capabilities in recent years. But while the Chinese Navy is currently the largest in the world, it still lags far behind the United States in terms of power projection. So, the world's largest trading power, China, is not also the world's most dominant naval power, which is a bit of an historical anomaly, but that's where the Belt and Road enters the discussion. Many of you have probably heard of the BRI in the context of China building a bunch of infrastructures in developing countries. But the BRI also serves the purpose of bypassing the risky Malacca Strait, relying instead on alternative land routes for its trade and energy supplies. It's no coincidence that China has invested heavily in rail, including the high-speed kind. And check this out. But another option may now be looming on the horizon, where nature has unintentionally lent a hand: the Arctic. As climate change is melting the Arctic ice cap, new shipping opportunities are now opening up. In fact, for China, shipping through the Arctic could cut the time to Europe by half and avoid existing choke points. At this point, the Arctic route is still aspirational, but if challenges are overcome, then maybe it could radically shift the geopolitical game around straits. Stuck ships, narrow supply chains, stuffed ports, the pandemic has surely contributed to make the invisible industry much more visible. And it was about time, because it's precisely what makes globalization work day in and day out. And potential disruptions, either caused by geopolitical gamesmanship, geographical constraints, or simply by the law of supply and demand, are always around the corner. But without freedom of navigation and low transport costs, well, we can all kiss goodbye to our Amazon second-day delivery and to those fresh avocados that we really like for brunch. And of course, we Italians wouldn't be able to have our most cherished espresso because Italy doesn't grow coffee. It comes here in one of those containers. Thank you for watching, and until next time on Espresso Shots.